Hi, this video is going to address the internal civil wars that were going on within the North. So not literally necessarily always fighting civil wars, but within the North and the South. So of course there was a lot of death and fighting between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America in the Civil War. But there also was resistance within each region to their own cause. So it's important to realize that Lincoln was campaigning not really on ending slavery, but the main thing when he was campaigning in the 1860 election was that, and this is a big part of the Republican Party platform at that time, was that there would be no more further expansion of slavery to the western territories and eventual states. So it's, we never know if Lincoln would have tried to abolish slavery if the Civil War had not broken out, but it's highly unlikely that he would have tried to do so. So there's, of course, quite a bit of racism in the North at that time. Just to be opposed to slavery didn't necessarily mean that you believed in equal rights or things of that nature. And even when the Civil War did break out, 4 states remained in the Union that were slave-holding states. Now, they weren't the states that were slave societies kind of dominated by slavery, but they did allow slavery. So Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky were slave-holding states that remained in the Union. So there was a lot of resistance even in the Union. There was a draft implemented in 1863, and so people that were kind of being forced to fight in this war, and there was tremendous resistance to this. There were draft riots in New York City. And after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in 1863, Lincoln's proclamation, it's often misinterpreted that freed all of the slaves. That's not really true. What it did say is that any of the slaves in the Confederate States were now free. But remember, the Confederate States at that point weren't following what Lincoln was saying anyways. They had broken away and effectively, in their minds, created a separate country, the Confederate States of America. But what the proclamation did that really had a tangible effect on the war was that it allowed the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army. And there were a lot of white soldiers that resented this and didn't like the fact that they started to increasingly view this as a war to potentially abolish slavery. And so a lot of the more kind of racist white people in the North that were fighting the Union side felt like they didn't really want to fight a war to try to end slavery. So there was that resistance in the North. In the South, it's important to remember that from the get-go, a lot of the slave states, some people today will say it didn't have anything to do with slavery, but that's just simply not true. For instance, the Mississippi Declaration of Causes, right at the beginning, it says our position, essentially their position of why they're separating from the Union, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. So it is right there in the documents that slavery was one of the issues, if not the crucial issue in secession. But you balance that with the fact that only about 20 to 25% of white Southerners actually owned slaves. So the majority of white Southerners did not own slaves. And some of them viewed the institution of slavery as something that was kind of undercutting their wages and their opportunities. So there was always kind of this class issue of slavery, of course, in terms of black and white, but even among whites there was this kind of class issues that the slavery had brought about. Okay, so once the war is going, and in the later years, like 64 and 1865, there's a lot of desertions, a lot of people leaving the Confederate Army, especially by 1865 when it's becoming a little more clear that the Confederate States will not be successful. And a lot of slaves are deserting. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous historian and civil rights leader, characterized this as a general strike, that the slaves were striking against their masters and trying to undercut and hurt the Confederate cause by doing simple things like breaking tools or not working. But the main way, of course, that they hurt the Confederate cause is by running away, often to the Union lines. But there were a lot of white desertions among the troops, and in places like North Carolina, western North Carolina, For instance, where slavery was not as dominant as it was, in a place like Alabama, for instance, there was a lot of resistance to the war even from the get-go, but in the later years especially. And things were kind of falling apart by 1865. And there were, like in Yadkin County, North Carolina, there were women that raided Confederate granaries because of the people were, starving because they weren't getting the rations that they were used to. And there were a lot of class tensions. Some people were, in the later years of the war in the South, were kind of seeking revenge on those elite whites that they felt like had kind of put them into this war. And especially among the whites that felt like, we never wanted slavery to begin with.